Ignatius Press and the Augustine Institute present the Formed Book Club. Catholic book lovers unpacking good books, chapter by chapter. If you like us, please help us by subscribing and by reviewing us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you might listen. And don't forget to sign up for weekly updates and study questions at formedbookclub.ignatius.com.
Welcome to the Formed Book Club with Vivi Udro, Joseph Pierce, myself, Father Fessio. We continue to discuss Joseph Carlo Ratzinger's The Spirit of Liturgy. You may have the commemorative edition, which is the most recent edition, or you may have the old edition beat up and underlined like mine is. I'm going to use mine, but I have the page numbers marked for yours, so I can give both sets of page numbers. This book will be handled a little differently, as you can see already, or hear and see already, than what we've done in the past, because this is something that's central to Ratzinger, central to my life. I've studied it, I've read it, I've taught it, I've underlined it, and so I'm kind of taking lead on this. And these next two chapters, which are chapter 2 and 3 of part 2, are, I believe, central to Ratzinger's thinking on this and to mine as well. And so this is going to be probably a lot of citations and then comment. So if you like this, great. If you don't give up on Formed Book Club because of this, because we'll go back to our normal pattern later. We talked about the first part, which is the essence of the liturgy and how important that word was for him, Wesen. The second part is on time and space in liturgy. We covered the first chapter last session, the relationship of the liturgy to time and space, some preliminary questions. So that says it apart. Now comes these two important chapters. Chapter 2, sacred places, the significance of the church building. Page 62 or 76 in the new edition. The chapter begins, even the staunchest opponents of sacred things, of sacred space in this case, accept that the Christian community needs a place to meet. And on that basis, they define the purpose of the church buildings in a non-sacral, strictly functional sense. So you got to meet somewhere. So it doesn't have to be sacred, right? But skipping down to by the middle there, similarly, the temples of all the other religions are usually not meeting places for worshipers, but cultic spaces reserved to the deity. And if you visit some of these shrines in Greece or in Rome, the god is there, but there's no room for anybody else. It's a place for the gods. The Christian church building soon acquired the name Domus Ecclesiae, the house of the church, the assembly of the people of God, because ecclesia from Greek, ekklesias means a calling, and ek means out, so calling out or gathering to. And then the abbreviation of the word ecclesia, assembly, or church. Now, church is from a different word. That's from the Greek kuriake, which means the Lord's, and it became Kirche in German and then church in English. But so you've got ecclesia, ecclesial, which is from the Latin tradition, and church, which is from the German, Greek tradition. It can be used not just of the living community, but also the building that housed it. So, at first it was the people, but then since they gathered in this place, it's the place where they gather. Continuing here, this development is accompanied by another idea. Christ himself offers worship as he stands before the Father. So this kind of connects the two. It's the house of the God, but it's the house of Christ, who's not our idol, but our real presence of God offering himself to the Father. So maybe 10 lines down on the next page, 63 or 77, St. Cyril of Jerusalem makes an interesting point about the word convocatio, which is Latin for synagogue, ecclesia, the assembly of the people called together and made his own by God. Middle of the page. The calling together, the assembly has a purpose, and that purpose is worship. That's going to be key in this chapter because it's not for us to have a social gathering. It's not for kind of making friends or integrating in the community is to come together to worship God. So 5 lines from the bottom or 6.
Can I just
Yeah, sure. Go ahead. Jump in.
highlight something there?
Yeah.
In other words, the building is for the worship of God, but the worship of God is intended to create a community,
That's right.
right? It's just, when people get the outcome, what means and ends mixed up, that always leads to problems.
Right. Among Jesuits, we had a thing called Conversations Which Matters. We had our monthly or whatever it is, quarterly meeting a couple of nights ago, and it was on friendship. And it was a lot of things about, what the box you have to check if you want to have friends, And one of the priests said, well, no, friendship is a gift. I said, exactly right. If you're trying to seek to have friends, you're not going to have many, not any good ones. Friendship is a byproduct, philia, of seeking the same thing with a person, and you share that goal, that mission, Likewise, the community of Christians is formed not by saying, hey, let's have a community, find out some reason to do it. No, we're going to worship God, and that brings us together.
Right.
6 or 7 lines from the bottom. Let us look more closely at the process by which church buildings took concrete form. Using the research of E.L. Sukenik and Louis Boyer, and Louis Boyer will be mentioned elsewhere here, who was a great theologian in the late 19th and early 20th century, a good friend of de Lubac's and Balthazar's and Ratzinger's, another author of Ignatius Press, has shown how the Christian house of God comes into being in complete continuity with the synagogue and thus acquires a specifically Christian newness. So we're going to see here that the Jews had 2 places of worship, the temple, where they all worshiped and offered sacrifice, and the synagogues, where they had prayer services and reading services, which are not in Jerusalem for the most part, and how the Christian place of worship is going to be the melding, if you were, of both the synagogue worship of the word and the temple sacrifice to the Lord. Next page, 6 lines down. For the Jews saw the synagogue in relation to the temple. A couple lines below that. Its orientation was always toward the presence of God. Now, for the Jews, this presence of God was and is indissolubly connected with the temple. Consequently, the synagogue was characterized by 2 focal points. Okay, so again, it's important that the Jews in their synagogues all had the synagogue face the place of the temple, just like mosques face Mecca, So the first is the seat of Moses. That's where the teaching goes on, right? Down about the middle of the page. What the seat of Moses stands for is this. Sinai, where God appeared to Moses, is not just a thing of the past. It is not mere human speech that is happening here. God is speaking. The seat of Moses then does not stand for itself and by itself, nor is it simply turned toward the people. No. The rabbi looks, as does everyone else in the synagogue, toward the Ark of the Covenant, or rather the shrine of the Torah, which represents the lost Ark. So, again, he's leading up to something here, which I think is important, which is namely facing east. But he's doing it by saying, this isn't just an idea of some new liturgist. This is rooted in the deepest spiritual tradition of Israel, which is our heritage, Next page, new paragraph, page 74 or 65. The synagogue and its shrine of the Torah contains a kind of Ark of the Covenant, which means it is the place of a kind of real presence. Here are kept the scrolls of the Torah, the living word of God, through which he sits on his throne in Israel among his own people. So God's presence in the word, I skip a page over to 67 or 81, your paragraph. I have lingered over this description of the synagogue because it exhibits already the essential and constant features of Christian places of worship. So again, he's harping on that. What's at the core? What's the deepest meaning? What's essential? 3 lines from the bottom. Christian faith produced 3 innovations in the form of the synagogue, as we just sketched it. So he's showing how our worship is rooted in the synagogue worship, but now he's going to say, what changes do we make? Last word on that page. And this first of all, the worshiper no longer looks toward Jerusalem. The destroyed temple is no longer regarded as the place of God's earthly presence, so we don't look towards Jerusalem anymore. A couple lines
Father,
down.
I'm sorry, Father, I've lost where you are.
We're on page 82.
82, 5 lines down now.
Thank you.
Christians look toward the east, the rising sun. This is not a case of Christians worshiping the sun, but of the cosmos speaking of Christ. And we already saw that when it came to the time of worship. It's historical, but it's also cosmic. Middle of the page. The east supersedes Jerusalem temple as a symbol. Christ, represented by the sun, is the place of the Shekinah, the true throne of the living God. Kabod is glory, but Shekinah, I think, is something like glory. I'm not sure what it means in Hebrew. Now, we're still on the first change that was made in the synagogue. Down a few lines. In the early church, prayer toward the east was regarded as an apostolic tradition. That means that's what the apostles did. This goes back to the practice of the apostles. We cannot date exactly when this turn to the east, the diverting of the gaze from the temple, took place, but it is certain that it goes back to the earliest times and was always regarded as an essential characteristic of Christian liturgy. Then, bottom of the page is the second, orientation is first and foremost a simple expression of looking to Christ as the meeting place between God and man. It expresses the basic Christological form of our prayer. Then comes the second part. The fact that we find Christ in the symbol of the rising sun is the indication of a Christology defined eschatologically. Eschaton in Greek means the last thing. The eschata, or the last things. We talk about the 4 last things: death, judgment, heaven, and hell. Praying toward the east means going to meet the coming Christ. So Christ is coming to us. The liturgy turned toward the east affects entry, so to speak, into the procession of history toward the future, the new heaven and the new earth. And then finally, about 8 lines below that, thus very early on in parts of Christendom, the eastward direction for prayer was given the added emphasis by reference to the cross. So those 3 things, facing east as Christ is the rising sun, facing east because he's the Christ who comes eschatologically, and then placing a cross there, which links the crucifixion with the second coming and history with the cosmos.
And the resurrection, right?
Yes.
The risen sun, so the resurrection and the second coming. Yeah. And what I like there, Father, about this is the fact, contrary to what we've been told or taught, at least the way I was told or taught, is that it's all about us all moving forward towards the Lord, right? We're all facing the same way. There's no center of attraction other than Christ. The orientation is all towards Christ, and we're all facing the same way or moving the same direction towards the risen Lord, whether it's in the resurrection or the second coming or heaven, or death on the cross. So, it's all facing the same way. And for me, when I came to realize that, and I might have come to realize that initially through experiencing the liturgy as you celebrated at Ave Maria when we were there together, the whole point about orientation ad orientem, it reoriented me. And what it did, it reminds me of this thing. You and I taught a course fairly recently on Chesterton at Ave Maria, about Chesterton's recurring motif of standing on your head, so you can see something for the first time. And that sometimes you realize you've actually, this is the first time you're standing the right way up. You'd always been standing on your head without realizing it. And this experience of ad orientem, or being oriented during the Mass in the right direction, which I largely thank you for, made me realize, hang on a second, I've been facing in the wrong direction the whole time. And now, I'm facing in the right direction at Mass. It was literally a revolutionary moment.
And because it's revolutionary, I think it's resisted by many who do not want to go back beyond the council, and I don't either. The thing is, the council itself, as we'll see in the next chapter, said nothing about changing the altar's orientation, but that has become sort of the central experience or symbol of Mass after the council. And so if you want to change the altar back to facing east, people think you're rejecting the council, which you're not. And the problem is, like say with Gregorian chant, you can add one chant to a Mass, like the Kyrie, and then later on add the Agnus Dei, and gradually bring people back to what the council really intended. But you can't change the altar 10 degrees, You either got to spin it around, or in fact, you just got to get into the side of it for most part. But it seemed like a revolution. And here's something that Vivian has experienced with me. I don't think Thomas has. The Ignatius Press for 27 years worked out of a house owned by the Carmelite nuns, whose monastery was next door. And they had a beautiful chapel on the corner, though, of Fulton and Parker. And because of the way they built it, the chapel had to face west. So it wasn't facing east. But once you got in there, you had the pews, you had the altar rail, you had a beautiful baldacchino, you had an altar, fixed altar against the tabernacle, and the cross above the tabernacle. And this was called Cristo Rey Monastery, Christ the King, right? And so they had a sculpture at the back wall, which is the risen Christ. And so I'll never forget this experience of celebrating Mass there at the consecration. You hold up the host, and you've got Christ present now at this sacrifice. You have the tabernacle with Christ remaining there. You've got the crucifix, the resurrection, and you've got the risen Christ there. So we didn't see the rising sun, but it was the same experience,
In fact, one of our two boys who would serve Father's masses as acolytes, one of our sons coming home from one of those masses says, "It's the most beautiful thing, Mom, to be kneeling there and looking up at the priest through the cross to the resurrection." He got it. He got how this world, we are a religion of symbols and symbolic language. And
amen. And just locally here, there are 3 parishes in where I live, and they're all diocesan parishes. They're not sort of part of any order, and they've all reoriented since we've been living here. And I remember that one of those parishes, the priest at the beginning of Lent said that as of Easter Sunday, we are going to start celebrating Ad Orientem, and he spent the whole of Lent at the homily part explaining, I think, using the spirit of liturgy as his basis of his argument, why this was important. And so by the time we got to Easter Sunday, the whole of the congregation, maybe 1 or 2 families left, but basically the whole of the congregation was absolutely on board and on fire for the idea, not just accepting, but embracing.
So you don't have to twist it slowly. You just have to prepare people and instruct people, because once they understand the beautiful reasons for these things, like you say, Joseph, they welcome them for the most part. Isn't it possible, Father, that one reason why after the council this confusion over the placement of the altar occurred is because one thing the council fathers did want was the people being closer to the altar.
Right.
And so a lot of these high altars that were way against the wall, and if you go to European churches, they're way far away from the nave. There might even be a choir in front of it and choir rails in front of it. And so this idea of bringing the altar closer so people can participate more. But with that came the priest going on the other side of it. And so I think those things got confused together, maybe, didn't they?
Did.
I agree completely with that. I mean, one good thing about the traditional high altar is it's impossible for the priest to go behind it, which is great. But I think the key thing here, as far as Father said at the beginning of before we went on this general discussion, was that there's this confusion, and of course it's not an accidental confusion in many cases, between what the Vatican II actually said and what people say it says in its spirit. And it's this confusion between the authentic spirit of Vatican II and the supposed spirit of Vatican II, which has caused the confusion. And many people think that things are contrary to Vatican II, which are not contrary to Vatican II. And that, of course, then fans the flames of the division. As some traditionalists think that Vatican II is evil because they don't know the difference between what the council taught and what people say the council taught, which is not the same thing.
Right.
And I want to add something to the image I gave before, because I mentioned from my point of view, I'm seeing the host and the tabernacle, but for someone in the pews, you're seeing also the priest who takes the place of Christ. And because he's not facing you, I mean, it's a better symbol for Christ, than a particular personal priest. Plus the fact, beautiful vestment might have on the back of it, might have a, Christ head crown or something like that,
So I'd be fine. I think, it's just human relations. You're looking towards someone, the natural thing to do is to see that particular individual human person, to see their face, to see their eyes. It's very difficult to actually get beyond that to the persona Christi. But when the priest is just facing the same way you are, and you can only see his back, see the elevation of the host, it's very easy to be at one with the priest in persona Christi. When he's looking at you, especially if you know him, right, it's very difficult to break that barrier, or at least more difficult to break that barrier.
Well, and speaking of the back of the vestment, often the backs of vestments have some kind of cruciform.
Right.
In the newer chasubles or whatever they are, it goes that way, and in the Baroque ones it does go that way. And so now the image of the priest standing in the place of Christ becomes very clear.
Amen.
Bottom of page 83 or 69 just sums up. Thus, the symbolism of the cross merges with that of the East, and that's why the altars have a cross that the priest can face. Next page, 84, 4 lines down. But finally, this turning toward the East also signifies that cosmos and saving history belong together. The cosmos is praying with us. It too is waiting for redemption. It is precisely this cosmic dimension that is essential, there it is again, to Christian liturgy. So once again, we're not just in this building looking at each other or looking even at the cross. We're looking out beyond the building, to the cosmos. A few lines down, I quote this a lot. I repeat it many times. That is why, wherever possible, we should definitely take up again the apostolic tradition of facing the East, both in the building of churches and the celebration of the liturgy. We shall come back to this later. We said something about the ordering of the liturgical prayer. Have I told my story about Ave Maria's church, the orientation? I'm going to tell it. Let's see how. Well, let's see. I'll tell the short form of this. When we were planning, Thomas Monahan, who was funded the whole thing, built the Ave Maria town and university. There was going to be, of course, a chapel there. They called it an oratory, a church, basically. And when the architects first came, they had the town on the church on the campus was facing north. But I said that there were 30 people around the table, all these big wig New York architects. And I said, well, we need to make that thing face east. So they were a little nonplussed, but okay, we'll do that. So while they went back to New York to make some changes, I was visiting with Carl Schönborn from Vienna, my classmate and friend of years ago, and his cathedral is St. Stephen's. The Feast of St. Stephen is December 26th. It was cornerstone, or the foundation was laid, I think, in 1227. He told me that St. Stephen's Cathedral does not face 90 degrees east. It faces the point on the azimuth where the sun rose on December 26 in 1227. I came back and I went on the internet and I went to the Naval Observatory and I was able to find out where the sun rose on March 25th, the Annunciation, in the year 2000. Because Ave Maria University, of course, that's the Annunciation, right? And so I found out it was something like 87 degrees and 26 minutes and 12 seconds, something like that. So now the architects came back and they're so proud of themselves. Father, we got to face the east. Well, there's just one slight alteration I want to make. Could you make it go 87 degrees, 26 minutes and so on? Okay, I explained why. So to this day now, not only the church, but the entire town of Ave Maria is oriented to the point where the sun rose on March 25th in the year 2000. And that's one legacy they can't take away from you. They're not going to adjust that church's orientation.
That's right.
Anyway, okay. Middle of that page. The second innovation in regard to the synagogue is follows. A new element has appeared that could not exist in the synagogue. At the east wall, or in the apse, there now stands an altar on which the Eucharistic sacrifice is celebrated, because you didn't have sacrifice in the synagogue. 10 lines from the bottom. Thus, the altar signifies the entry of him who is the Orient into the assembled community, and the going out of the community from the prison of this world to the curtain now torn open, the participation in the past, the passing over from the world to God. So it's beautiful how he integrates that thing of exitus, reditus. Now we've got the altar there, so that this Christ who's coming to us is actually present in our midst. Next page, just above the middle there. We have more to say about the practical consequences of the significance of the Christian altar, because the question of the correct position of the altar is at the center of the post-conservative debate. Well, that's true. Now, 3 lines below that, the third point to be noted is that the shrine of the Word remained, even though with regard to its position in the church building. However, of necessity, there's a fundamental innovation here. The Torah is replaced by the Gospels, which alone can open up the meaning of the Torah. Moses, says Christ, wrote of me, the shrine of the Word, the Ark of the Covenant, now becomes the throne of the Gospel. So that's the third change there.
Yeah, Father, just if I may, because you left out the one passage on page 85 actually highlighted. So,
okay.
So the altar is the place where heaven is opened up. It does not close off the church, opens it up and leads it into the eternal liturgy. I just like the fact that the eastern facing, the oriented altar is like something which opens the door to eternity. I just love that.
And here's a question. Because in the synagogue and in the early church, there were two different things going on, the word and the altar of sacrifice. So isn't that something the council wanted to do, was take the word off of the altar and put it on to the ambo or pulpit or something?
Exactly. You separate the liturgy of the word and the liturgy of the sacrifice. Again, the council, especially the document, and then some of the reforms that took place, I believe were beautifully done and properly done and theologically done, and will bear fruit in the future. Next page, towards the end of this chapter, 4 lines down. During the liturgy of the word, the congregation gathered around the shrine of the sacred books, or around the seat associated with it, which evolved quite spontaneously from the east, from the seat of Moses to the bishop's throne. So, first part of liturgy, you're around the throne of the seat of Moses. A few lines below that. At the end of the liturgy of the word, during which the faithful stand around the bishop's seat, everyone walks together with the bishop to the altar, and now the cry resounds, Conversia Dominum, turn toward the Lord. In other words, look toward the east with the bishop. And so, to me, that's a beautiful drama of the Mass, as it should be celebrated traditionally, is that at the beginning of the Mass, the priest is representing God to the people, proclaiming the word, explaining the word, and then with the responsorial psalm, we have this antiphonal response, alteration. Then come the gifts which the people bring to the priest. And now the people represent the priest towards God. And he turns with them to make that offering to God.
Mhm.
And then, of course, often people think, that the consecration is the high point of the Mass. It's not. Very important. But the high point of the Mass, the crown of the consummation, I could call it, is when, after the great elevation, now the priest turns to the people to give communion. And that's, the host is not primarily to be looked at, although we can adore and we should adore. It's meant to unite us with the bridegroom. And so that beautiful drama of the priest facing with the people, towards the people in the word, with the people in the sacrifice, and back to the people as the bridegroom with the bride.
Beautiful.
Finally, bottom of the page here. Finally, we must mention one last difference between the synagogue and in the early church buildings. In Israel, only the presence of men was deemed to be necessary for divine worship. And then towards the very end of the chapter there, next page, even though the public liturgy of the word was not entrusted to women, they were included in the liturgy as a whole in exactly the same way as men. And so that's an important development in Christianity, that women had a greater part in the worship service.
Is that enough for one session?
I think it's enough. Yeah, I think we've exhausted it, everybody.
Well, I played the prophet because in the discussion questions, I presumed we'd only manage one chapter, so I was proved correct. So next time, Father, we are assuming just one chapter again.
Well, it's
not
not
to be ambitious.
Probably, yeah. This one is the densest chapter in the whole book, I think. So let's assume we'll just do one there.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody. If you're still there, you are. Come back next week. We'll see you. God bless you.
If you enjoyed this discussion, please help spread the word about the Forum Book Club by subscribing to the podcast and writing a review. You can sign up for weekly updates at forumbookclub.ignatius.com.